Before I take you inside the truth that haunted generations, I need you to stay with me, every word, every secret. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just a story, it's a life that was stolen, a family torn apart. If you feel the weight of this with me, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Let's face this together. It was raining so hard that night the sound became almost like a chant, relentless, angry, like the sky itself wanted to wash something away. I remember sitting on the edge of her bed, the room dimly lit by the yellow lamp that flickered each time thunder rolled across the valley. She was old now, her hands trembling, her eyes sunken, yet still piercing, as if they could see through all the masks I had worn in my life. She looked at me, and I knew she was carrying something heavy, something that had waited too long to be spoken. "Sit down," she said. Her voice cracked on the edges of each word, like dry paper tearing. I obeyed. The smell of damp wood and old perfume hung in the air, a strange mix of decay and nostalgia. She reached for a box beneath her pillow, wrapped in fabric, bound with a faded blue ribbon. "I should have burned this," she whispered. "But sins don't burn that easily." For a moment, I thought she was delirious. The storm had always made her anxious. Maybe it was just that. But then she opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied together with twine, the ink blurred by years of moisture. The top one was dated 1947. My chest tightened. I wasn't even born then, and yet something told me that my life, everything I thought I knew, was buried inside those pages. She took a deep breath and said, almost pleading, "What I'm about to tell you must never leave this room. Promise me." I nodded. My throat was dry. I didn't know that promise would become the heaviest burden of my life. The first words left her lips like a confession dragged from the soul. "Your grandfather wasn't who you think he was." The clock ticked once, twice. Then silence, except for the rain tapping against the glass like nervous fingers. I remember the flicker of the lamp reflecting in her tears. "He was a good man to you," she continued, "but he built this family on a lie, on someone else's pain. And I helped him." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could feel the walls closing in, the room smaller with every sentence. She began to tell me about a deal made in 1943 in a small village south of Lisbon during the chaos of war. A deal that exchanged truth for survival, blood for inheritance. "He promised them safety," she said, staring past me, "but he took everything, their home, their land, their dignity. We built our fortune on their ashes." I could hardly breathe. The woman I loved and respected all my life, my grandmother, was confessing to a crime that echoed across generations. When she handed me one of the letters, my hands shook so badly I almost tore it. The paper was thin, almost transparent, and written in Portuguese too formal for modern speech. "To those who come after," it began, "know that what you inherit is not gold, but guilt." I looked up, my eyes meeting hers. "Why now?" I asked. "Why tell me this after all these years?" She closed her eyes. "Because the curse doesn't die with silence," she said softly. "It feeds on it." Lightning flashed, painting the room in brief white light. And for the first time, I noticed something on the wall, a photo I had never seen before. My grandparents, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, with another couple beside them, a man and woman, both young, both staring directly at the camera with eyes that looked too terrified. "They were our friends," she whispered. Until they weren't. The storm outside grew louder, as if it wanted to drown her words. But it was too late. The truth had found its way into the world again. And in that moment, sitting beside her fragile body, I realized something chilling. Every smile, every celebration, every story we told at family dinners was built over the bones of a secret. She began coughing, her body shaking, and I rushed to hold her hand. "Please," she gasped. "Promise me you'll find what they left behind." The truth must outlive the lie, I promised, not knowing that promise would destroy everything I still had. The storm raged on. And as the lights finally went out, I sat in the dark, holding her trembling hand, feeling the weight of generations pressing against my chest. That was the night I learned the truth doesn't just set you free, it breaks you first. I didn't sleep that night. The storm passed, but its echo stayed in my chest. By morning, the room smelled of rain and medicine, and the light leaking through the curtains felt too clean for what I'd heard. She was still asleep, her breathing uneven, the box of letters resting on the table beside her bed like a silent witness. When she woke, she didn't speak of it again. She just looked at me and said, "Breakfast is in the kitchen," as if the night before had been a fever dream. But it wasn't. The letters were real. The faces in that old photograph were real. And so was the shame that now pulsed inside me like a second heartbeat. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go on with my life, but the world had changed its texture. The house I grew up in, that old estate near Sintra, surrounded by pines and fog, no longer felt like home. Every creak in the floorboards whispered secrets, every family portrait seemed to watch me with judgment. My father, proud and stoic, never once mentioned his parents' past. He was a man of tradition, of honor, as he used to call it. But I began to wonder if honor was just the word we used to perfume our guilt. One evening, I asked him casually, did grandfather ever live near Lisbon during the war? He looked up from his glass of wine, a deep red, almost black, and his jaw tightened. "Why are you asking that?" he said. I shrugged. I found an old photograph. There was another couple in it. He set the glass down with a soft click. "You've been talking to your grandmother again, haven't you?" I didn't answer. He sighed. "She's old. Her mind wanders. Don't let her fill your head with stories that never happened. Our family worked hard for what we have. Don't dig up ghosts." But his tone gave him away, too sharp, too fast, like someone stepping on glass. That was the first time I realized how deep the manipulation ran. For decades, silence had been our family's favorite currency. We didn't discuss the past, we curated it. Birthdays, weddings, funerals, all rehearsed performances of dignity. I saw it now, how every gesture, every phrase like "we've always done things this way," was just a wall to keep the truth buried. Weeks turned into months. I began to read the letters one by one. Most were written by a man named Matthias Andrade, a name I had never heard before. His handwriting was elegant, deliberate, as if each word carried both pride and despair. The letters told a story of trust and betrayal. He had been a friend, perhaps even a business partner, until my grandfather seized everything during the war's chaos. One letter spoke of a vineyard, another of a promise of safety, a promise that ended in exile. I read them late at night, hiding them in my desk drawer. The ink bled into my mind. By the time my grandmother fell ill again, I had memorized every word, but she refused to speak of it anymore. "Some scenes," she said weakly, "grow roots. Pulling them out destroys the soil." Still, I couldn't let it go. In 2019, after she passed away, I found myself alone in the old house, cleaning out her things. The silence was unbearable. That's when I discovered something else, a sealed envelope inside the lining of her jewelry box. On the front, in fading blue ink, it said, "For the one who dares." Inside was a single page, and a name, Cosa Andrade, Rua das Oliveiras, Evora. The air seemed to thicken. I remembered one of Matthias's letters mentioning Evora, a house lost to deceit and greed. It couldn't be a coincidence. That night, I searched for it online. The address still existed. A crumbling estate on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned, sold, and resold through decades. My hands trembled as I stared at the photo on the screen. The gate was rusted, the windows broken, but the shape of it was the same house in that photograph from 1947. I felt something awaken inside me. Guilt, yes, but also a strange sense of duty, as if the dead had passed me their unfinished sentence to complete. When I told my father I was going to Evora, he exploded. "You will do no such thing," he shouted. "That place has nothing to do with us." His voice cracked, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in him. Not anger, fear. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip like iron. "You don't understand, son. Some truths can't be fixed. They only destroy." I looked him in the eyes and said, quietly, "Then maybe they deserve to." He turned away, trembling, and said nothing more. That was the last conversation we ever had about it. A week later, I packed a small bag, took my grandmother's box of letters, and drove south toward Evora. The road was empty, the sky grey with drizzle, and I remember thinking, if ghosts could choose weather, it would always rain. When I reached the edge of the city, I parked the car and stood before the gate. The air was cold, the earth smelled of rust and time. And as I pushed the gate open, the hinges screamed like something alive. That was the first sound of the past waking up. The gate gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty field. Beyond it, the house stood like a wounded animal, still proud, but hollowed out. Its windows were dark holes, its walls mottled with moss and time. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and old stone. I walked up the cracked path, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the silence. It had been decades since anyone lived there. You could feel it, that stillness of places that have seen too much. The front door was unlocked. Or maybe it had simply given up resisting. It creaked open under my hand, and a gust of cold air slipped past me, carrying the scent of mold and burnt wood. Dust floated in thin beams of light, cutting through the broken shutters. I stepped inside. Every corner felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory itself. The furniture was gone, but the walls still carried marks where paintings once hung. I ran my hand along one of them, and the dust came away like ash. On the far side of the room, I noticed something, faint lettering carved into the plaster near the fireplace. Andrade, 1944. My breath caught. This was their house. This was where it all began. I pulled out the oldest letter from my bag, dated March 1944. The words blurred slightly under the fading ink. "If this reaches you, know that we are safe for now. Your husband promised protection," I believed him, foolishly. I sat on the cold floor and kept reading, one letter after another. The storm of words growing heavier with each page, the story pieced itself together slowly. Painfully. Mateus Andrade and his wife, Clara, had trusted my grandfather, Joaquim Duarte, a man of influence, clever, connected to people who could make things happen during the war. He promised to help them hide assets from confiscation, to protect their property until peace returned. But when Mateus and Clara fled the country, Joaquim claimed the estate as his own, sold their vineyards, changed the deeds. The Andrades never returned, or perhaps never survived long enough to try. And we, the Duartes, built our legacy on that theft. I felt sick. The letters weren't just history. They were evidence. Thunder rumbled outside, distant but growing. It was almost poetic. The same weather that had carried the confession now followed me here. I got up and explored further, flashlight in hand. In the back hall, a door led to the cellar. It was half buried in the ground, the wood warped, but I forced it open. The air inside was colder, thick with mildew. My light trembled over the stone walls. And then I saw it, a small wooden chest, barely visible beneath debris. The same kind of chest my grandmother had kept her letters in. I knelt down, brushed away the dirt, and opened it. Inside were documents, deeds, receipts, names. Everything my grandfather had taken. And at the bottom, a photograph. The same photograph that hung in my grandmother's room, but this one was different. This time, someone had written on the back in neat cursive, "To the man who saved us." Until he didn't, my stomach turned. Then something else caught my eye. Beneath the papers, there was a sealed envelope, stamped in dark red wax. No address. Just the initials JD. Joaquim Duarte. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a short letter written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. If you are reading this, then the truth has reached you. I never meant for it to last this long. I told myself I did what was necessary, but necessity is the coward's word for greed. I ruined them, and I ruined her too. Forgive me, if you can, but if you must destroy the name Duarte to restore the name Andrade, do it. End what I began, the words blurred before my eyes. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, shaking the walls. I sat there holding that letter, his confession, realizing the weight of what it meant. My entire family's history, our home, our inheritance, all of it was stolen. And now I had proof. But proof is not freedom. Proof is a weapon, and weapons destroy whoever holds them. I don't know how long I stayed there in that cellar, listening to the rain hammering the roof. I thought of my father, his silence, his fear. I thought of my grandmother, whispering about curses that feed on silence. And for the first time, I understood her. Because silence wasn't our curse. Legacy was. I left the house near midnight. The storm had stopped, but the air was still electric, heavy with what I'd found. As I closed the gate behind me, I looked back one last time. And though the house was empty, I could swear I saw a shadow at the window, a figure standing where the Andrades once did, watching me go. I whispered, "I'll fix this." I promise, but promises, in my family, had always been where the damage began. The road back to Sintra felt longer than before. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low over the hills, like bruises that refused to fade. I drove with the box of letters on the passenger seat and the sealed documents from Evora beside them, feeling as though I was transporting ghosts. Each time the tires hit the wet asphalt, the sound seemed to echo a heartbeat, not mine, but the one that history itself had left behind. By the time I reached the house, it was dusk. The lights were on, warm against the cold fog. I stood by the front door for a long time, hand frozen over the doorknob. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice again. Some sins grow roots. When I finally went in, my father was in his study, the smell of whiskey hanging in the air. He didn't look surprised to see me, just tired. His eyes flicked to the box in my hands. "You went," he said flatly. I nodded. I did. He stared at the fireplace without speaking. The flames reflected in his glass like tiny wars being fought in silence. I placed the envelope on his desk. "I found this," I said. "Grandfather wrote it." He confessed he didn't touch it, didn't even look at it. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Do you think I didn't know?" The words hit me harder than I expected. "You knew." My voice came out cracked, almost childish. "All this time. You knew what he did." He finally looked at me, his eyes red around the edges. "I grew up with it. Every wall in this house has whispered that story to me since I was 10 years old. But what would you have me do? Tear everything down? Give away what generations built on what wasn't ours?" I said sharply. He slammed the glass down so hard the liquid spilled. "On what kept us alive." His voice broke. "You think you understand sacrifice. You think it's simple." He did what he had to do to protect this family. And so did I. I took a step closer. Protect us from what? The truth. He turned away, his hand trembling as he reached for the bottle again. "From shame," he muttered. "From hunger. From the kind of ruin that turns a man into dust before he dies." His words should have moved me, but all I could feel was rage. "Then maybe we deserved the ruin," I said quietly. He froze. For a long time, there was only the crackling of the fire. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "You sound just like her." I didn't need to ask who her was. My grandmother. The woman who'd broken the silence and paid for it with isolation and guilt. I wanted to tell him everything I'd read, everything I'd seen in that house in Evora. But the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something deeper than fear, a resignation, like a man who had already been carrying a sentence for decades. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. Finally, he said, if you tell the world what you found, you'll destroy us. The family name. The company. Everything. Is that what you want? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. I left the room without another word. Upstairs, the corridors felt narrower, the portraits heavier. Every generation of Duartes stared down from the walls, stern men and hollow-eyed women, painted in oil and arrogance. Their silence screamed louder than thunder. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the rain start again, and thought about what my father had said. Maybe he was right, maybe some truths weren't meant to be told. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of Moteus and Clara Andrade in that old photograph. Their eyes weren't just terrified, they were alive, pleading. By dawn, I had made my decision. If my family had stolen a legacy, I would return it. Even if it meant losing everything. The first step was the hardest, contacting the authorities in Evora. I didn't know where to begin. But when I explained that I'd found documents tied to a family who had lived there before 1944, they directed me to the National Archive. I sent digital copies of the letters and deeds, my heart pounding as I hit send. It felt like pulling a trigger. Days passed, then weeks. My father stopped speaking to me. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like mourning. Then one morning, I received a call. A woman's voice, calm but formal, Mr. Duarte, we've reviewed the materials you sent. There's something you should see. Could you come to Lisbon? I went that same afternoon. The archive building was cold and smelled of old paper. The woman who greeted me, Dr. Helena Ramos, led me through a maze of shelves and folders until we reached a small room with a single table. On it were several files marked classified -1944. She handed me one and said, "We found records of the Andrades. But there's something you don't know." I opened the file, expecting death certificates. What I saw instead froze my blood. Photographs. Dozens of them. A man and woman under military custody, dated May 1944. At the bottom of the page, a note in Portuguese, transferidos por ordem DJ. Duarte transferred, by order of my grandfather. I looked up at her, unable to speak. She nodded slowly. It wasn't just a theft, she said softly. It was a betrayal that ended in arrest. They never made it out of the country. My hands began to shake. Where were they sent? She hesitated. To a labor camp in Morocco. There are no records of their release. The room spun. I pressed my palms to the table, trying to breathe. He hadn't just stolen their home. He'd signed their death. Everything went quiet, the hum of lights, the shuffling of papers, all of it faded until there was only one sound left in my head, the rain, still falling on that night of confession, over and over again. I drove back from Lisbon in silence. The radio stayed off, the world outside blurred by the steady drizzle that never seemed to end. The highway stretched like an artery through the mist, a long, grey vein connecting the dead to the living. I could still hear Dr. Ramos's voice in my head. They never made it out of the country. Those words wouldn't leave me. They didn't echo, they burned. When I reached the house, the lights were off except for my father's study. I could see his shadow through the frosted glass, the same posture, the same stillness. For a moment, I stood outside the door, watching him like a stranger might, realizing how much of my life had been spent orbiting his silence. I entered quietly. He didn't look up. "So," he said finally, his tone calm but sharp. "You've been to Lisbon." I nodded. My throat felt dry. "They found them." He turned his face toward me, expression unreadable. "Alive, no." He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath, like a man exhaling half a century of ghosts. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You can't let this become public. It wasn't a plea. It was an order." I stared at him. "You're asking me to hide it. I'm asking you to protect your family," he said. His voice rose slightly. You think the world will understand? That they'll see a desperate man during a war, not a monster. They won't. They'll see our name and tear it apart. Everything your grandfather built, everything I've held together, gone. I took a step forward. They were innocent, Father. He didn't just steal from them, he condemned them. He turned suddenly, eyes wet and furious. Do you think I don't know that? The outburst stunned me. He gripped the edge of his desk, breathing hard. I've lived with this every day of my life. The only reason you have the luxury to judge me now is because I kept this family standing. If you destroy that, what will be left? Guilt and ashes. I didn't answer. Because part of me, the part raised under his roof, understood. That was the worst part. Then he said something I didn't expect. Something that twisted everything. They offered to buy your silence. I blinked. What? He sighed and sat down. Helena Ramos called me before she called you. The archive is under pressure, investors, the press. If this story goes public, it's not just us who fall. Entire names, old families, businesses that trace back to those years. She said there's a way to manage it. Quietly, do you feel it? The weight of their secrets. The moment you just heard changes everything. Don't let this story end here. Like, share, and subscribe so you can see the rest. And comment below, what would you do if your family's entire history was built on lies? I stepped back. You made a deal. He shook his head. No. I'm asking you to. There it was, the impossible request. Take the offer, he said softly. Donate a portion to a historical fund. Keep the rest. And bury this. No one has to know. I felt something inside me collapse. You're asking me to profit, I whispered, from the same crime he committed. He looked away. I'm asking you to survive. For a long time, there was only silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that fills the air when a soul splits in two. I thought of my grandmother, her fragile voice whispering, the curse doesn't die with silence. I thought of Moteus and Clara Andrade, the ink fading from their last letters. And I thought of the house in Evora, its walls still carrying their names. My father stood, slowly. He walked to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His grip was weak, but his eyes held mine, full of something I'd never seen before. Not power. Not anger. Desperation. Please, he said quietly. I've lost everything already. Your mother, your respect, the peace I never had. Don't take the name too. It was the first time he'd ever said please to me. And it broke me. Because love, even poisoned, twisted, undeserved, still knows how to bleed. That night, I sat alone in my room, the offer letter open on my desk. Numbers stared back at me, a sum large enough to silence the truth forever. Enough to erase the story from every archive, every headline, every whispered rumor. I poured myself a drink and stared at the paper until dawn. Then I called Drive.Ramos. When she answered, I said, if I refuse, what happens? Her voice was calm. Then the story becomes public. Your family will face the consequences. And maybe the truth will finally breathe. And if I accept, then it dies again. She paused, then added gently, you can't save both, Mr. Duarte. You have to choose which legacy to kill. I hung up without speaking. Outside, the rain had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the world was silent. No thunder, no storms, just the sound of wind moving through the pines. And somehow, that silence felt louder than any scream. I didn't make a decision that night. Or maybe I did, in silence, without realizing it. The morning came grey and cold, light spilling weakly through the curtains. I hadn't slept. The glass of whiskey still sat on the desk, untouched now, the surface filmed over like the water of a forgotten pond. The house was quiet to quiet. My father's door was closed, as always. I went downstairs, the old wood groaning under my steps. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, distant, then silence again. I sat at the table and unfolded one of Moteus's letters, the one dated February 1944. I'd read it before, but something in me wanted to see it again, to trace the path that had led us here. The handwriting, precise yet trembling, described how my grandfather had offered to protect them through a false transfer of property. But then my eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before, a line near the bottom, faint, almost erased by time. Clara worries for the child. I told her he will be safe once Joaquim signs the papers. The child, I froze. The letter had never mentioned a child before. None of them had. My heart began to race. I went through the rest, one by one, until I found another mention, in the very last letter. If you find this, know that the boy carries both our names, though the world may never know it. Both our names. I sat back, staring at the words, a strange chill running through me. I grabbed my grandmother's box and took out the photograph again, the one from 1947. Moteus and Clara standing beside my grandparents. I looked at it for a long time, and then, suddenly, I saw it, the boy. Barely visible behind them, 6, maybe 7 years old, half hidden by Clara's dress. I'd never noticed him before. But now, looking closely, I saw something else, his eyes. Blue-grey dot familiar. My pulse quickened. I rushed to the hall where the family portraits hung, the generations of Duarte staring down in judgment. I scanned them until I found the one of my father as a child, taken sometime in the early 1950s. He was standing between my grandparents, his face solemn, his eyes the same blue-grey dot. No, it couldn't be. I stumbled back, the photograph shaking in my hand. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the picture I'd taken of the 1947 photo, and compared them side by side. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was undeniable. I ran to my father's study. He was there sitting by the fire again, eyes red and distant. He didn't react when I entered. I dropped the photo on his desk. Who is he? He glanced down at it, then up at me, silent. The boy, I said, my voice breaking. Who is he? He didn't answer. His hand went to his face, covering his mouth. Tell me, his voice came out low, almost a whisper. You shouldn't have gone back. I slammed my hand on the desk. Who is the child, father? He closed his eyes. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't speak. Then, with a long exhale, he said, He's me. The room went silent. I felt dizzy. What are you talking about? He opened a drawer and pulled out a small, yellowed envelope. Your grandmother left this for me when she died. I wasn't supposed to show you, but maybe it's time. He handed it to me. Inside was a birth certificate, faded, almost unreadable, dated 1943, in Evora. And a father, Joaquim Duarte. And a mother, Clara Andrade. My throat closed. No, I whispered. He looked at me with eyes that seemed suddenly ancient. He didn't just steal their home. He stole me. The words hit like thunder. He took me when they were arrested, he continued. Told the authorities I was his nephew. When they died, he made me his son. Your grandmother agreed. She couldn't have children. They raised me as their own. I couldn't breathe. My father, the man who'd spent his life defending that legacy, was half Andrade. The bloodline itself was the curse. He told me when I was 16, he said quietly, said it was mercy, said I should be grateful. And I was. For a long time. Until I learned what he'd done to them. Then I hated him. But by then, it was too late. The name Duarte was already carved into my skin. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something between shame and relief. Now you understand. If you expose this, you destroy both families. The victims and the guilty. There's no clean side left. I sank into the chair opposite him, the world spinning. The truth wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a mirror. And I hated what it showed. Outside, the rain started again, soft at first, then heavier, as if the sky itself couldn't stand to hear what we'd just said. I looked at the fire, the letters, the proof scattered across the desk. All of it suddenly meaningless. The Duarte fortune, the Andrade curse. 2 names, one sin, one blood. And in that moment, I realized the truth had no sides. It only had consequences. That night, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, surrounded by papers, letters, photographs, and ghosts. The rain had stopped, but the silence that followed was even louder. My father had gone to bed, or maybe he hadn't, I didn't check. The house felt hollow, like a mouth that had finally run out of words. I looked down at the documents again, the letters from Moteus, the forged deeds, the birth certificate that rewrote our bloodline. Everything was here. Everything I needed to destroy the Duarte name. But whose name was that now? His, mine, ours. It was almost dawn when I realized I was shaking. The air was cold, yet my palms were sweating. The truth, this sacred, unbearable thing, didn't feel like justice anymore. It felt like a trap. At 6:12 a.m., my phone vibrated. A message from Luciana, the journalist I'd been quietly working with for months. Any progress on the documents, she wrote. If we can confirm what happened in 43, it could make front-page history. History. That word made me sick. I typed, I have everything. Then, before hitting send, I stopped. My reflection in the phone's black screen looked unfamiliar. Pale, hollow-eyed, older. I deleted the message when I finally stood. The morning light was creeping through the curtains, pale gold slicing through the shadows. I went outside. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. At the far end of the property, the family chapel stood like a monument to hypocrisy, white stone streaked with moss, the Duarte crest still carved above the door. I hadn't been inside in years. The door creaked open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was cool, still. Dust floated in the light, cutting through the stained glass. I walked to the altar and stopped. Beneath it, engraved on a brass plaque, were the words my grandfather had chosen for himself. Truth is the legacy of the righteous. I laughed, a bitter, quiet laugh that echoed off the stone walls. I knelt not to pray, but because my legs gave out. I pressed my hands against the cold marble and whispered, was any of this worth it? And then, from somewhere deep inside, I heard my grandmother's voice, or maybe I imagined it. We do not inherit sins. We inherit choices. That line hit me harder than anything, because I finally understood I wasn't bound to their crime, unless I chose to be. But choosing freedom meant destroying everything else, my father's life, the family's reputation, the illusion that had built our entire world. I spent the next 3 days in silence. No calls, no visits. Just me and the documents, spread across the dining table like an autopsy. Each night, I thought I'd made my decision. Each morning, I changed my mind again. On the 4th day, my father knocked on my door. He looked weak, older than I'd ever seen him. You haven't eaten, he said. I'm fine, I lied. He stepped inside. His hand trembled slightly as he rested it on the back of a chair. You think exposing this will make you free, he said. But it won't. It'll only give the dead new ways to haunt you. I looked at him, the man who was both victim and heir of the same crime. And silence won't. He smiled, a broken smile. Silence is what kept us alive this long. Then he turned and left. That night, I drove to the edge of town, to the old publishing house where Luciana worked. The streets were empty, wet from another burst of rain. I sat in the car for almost an hour, the folder of documents on the passenger seat. Every minute that passed, the decision grew heavier, until I could barely breathe. I took out one of the photos, my father as a child, holding a wooden horse. His smile was small, uncertain. Behind him stood my grandfather, hand on his shoulder, the image of a proud man who'd buried his sins under stone and inheritance. And then I saw it, something I hadn't before. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a hand. A woman's hand, Clara's. resting gently on the boy's other shoulder. 2 worlds, 1 touch. I started crying, not from grief, from exhaustion, from understanding, because I finally knew what this story was. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about carrying what couldn't be erased and choosing what came next. I turned the key in the ignition. The headlights flicked on. The city stretched before me, silent, waiting. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a Duarte or an Andrade. I just felt human. But I still hadn't made my choice. Not yet. The night I chose was colder than the rest. The kind of cold that settles in your bones, quiet and deliberate, as if the air itself is waiting for a confession. I drove without music, without thought, following the empty road that led back to the old Duarte estate, to the house that had witnessed every secret, every silence. The gates creaked as I pushed them open. The garden was soaked, the grass glistening under the faint moonlight. I parked near the veranda, where my grandmother used to sit at dusk with her tea, pretending peace had ever lived here. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and old memories. The power had flickered out earlier that week, or maybe my father had cut it off. Either way, I lit a candle. Its flame trembled, painting long shadows over the walls lined with family portraits. Their faces seemed to move in the dim light, watching me, judging me. The folder sat heavy in my hands, the documents, the letters, the certificate. Proof of everything. Proof that the Duarte name had been built not on honor, but on theft and lies. I walked to the fireplace. The same one where my grandmother used to warm her hands, where my father had confessed the truth. The ashes from our last fire still lingered there, grey and silent. I set the folder down. I stared at it for a long time. My hands wouldn't move. I could feel the weight of generations pressing down on me, whispering their prayers, their excuses, their curses. Then I heard it, soft footsteps behind me. "Don't," my father said. His voice was barely a sound. I turned. He was standing at the door, in his robe, face half-lit by the candle's glow. He looked older than ever, fragile, almost transparent. "I thought you were asleep," I said. He shook his head. "No one sleeps when the truth's on fire." We stood in silence, the air thick between us. "You knew I'd come here," I said. "I hoped you wouldn't," he whispered. "But I knew you would." He took a step closer. "I spent my whole life trying to fix what I didn't break, trying to make our name mean something good. But every brick I laid was made from someone else's sorrow. You think burning it will save us?" I looked at him. Double quotes, "No. I think burning it will end us." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what's needed." His words surprised me. He moved to the table, his trembling fingers brushing over the papers. "Do it, then," he said, "end it. Burn it all." His voice cracked on the last word. The flame flickered between us, small, alive, waiting. I picked up the first page, the letter from Moteus. My hand shook. The ink had faded, but the pain was still there, written in the spaces between words. I held it over the fire. The paper curled, hissed, and turned black. The smell of burning ink filled the room. My father closed his eyes. I fed another page to the fire, then another. And with each one, something inside me broke, not out of regret, but relief. The lies, the guilt, the inheritance of silence, all of it became ash. When it was done, only the candle remained. The flame was smaller now, weak. I stared at the fireplace, the last embers glowing like dying stars. "Now what?" I whispered. My father's answer was almost inaudible. "Now we live." He walked to the window, opened it. The cold wind rushed in, scattering the smoke. I could hear the rain again, soft against the glass, washing the scent of fire away. I stood beside him. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, pale and uncertain, but real. He looked at me. "You know," he said, "truth doesn't disappear when you burn it. It just stops belonging to others. I didn't answer. I just nodded, watching the smoke fade into the grey sky. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt empty. And maybe that was a beginning. I turned to him. Do you think they'd forgive us? He smiled, a sad, small smile. I don't think forgiveness is what they wanted. Just someone to stop pretending. We stood there until the fire died completely, the candle flickering out soon after. And for the first time, silence didn't scare me. Days passed, but time didn't feel real anymore. The house smelled of smoke long after the last ember had died. The walls were stained, not from soot, from memory. Every time I walked through the corridor, I felt as though the ghosts had simply changed form, hiding now in the empty frames, in the faint scent of burned paper that no rain could wash away. My father barely spoke. He moved through the house like a shadow, sitting by the window, staring at nothing. Sometimes I'd find him holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Other times I'd catch him in the study, his eyes lost in the space where the letters once were, whispering names that no longer existed in our history books. The estate was silent, no visitors, no calls. Word spread, somehow, that the Duartes were closing things. Our employees were paid and dismissed. The lawyers stopped sending papers. The town stopped talking about us, and yet, somehow, I could feel its eyes, still watching, still waiting for the next rumor. I didn't tell Luciana the truth. I sent her a message, nothing substantial. Just family myths, she replied. That's a shame. Stories like that matter, and I thought, they do. But not to be sold. For weeks I tried to sleep, but dreams came in fragments, flashes of firelight, of Clara's hand on the boy's shoulder, of my grandfather's voice saying, "Truth is the legacy of the righteous," only now it sounded like mockery. One morning, I woke to the sound of the front door closing. My father was gone. He'd left a note on the kitchen table, written in his shaky handwriting, "Don't come looking for me. Some stories are better finished in silence. Take the house if you want. Or burn it too." Just live. There was no signature, just his initials. I drove for hours, searching along the coast, through towns where no one knew our name. But he had vanished, like he'd been swallowed by the same fog that had protected our lives for generations. When I returned, the house felt heavier than ever. But I didn't cry. I think I was past tears. I started going through the rooms one by one, emptying drawers, packing old portraits into boxes. Each time I touched a piece of our history, I felt something loosen inside me, a thread snapping, quietly. In the attic, I found a trunk I'd never noticed before. Inside were notebooks, ledgers, faded photographs, receipts from the 1930s, evidence of lives lived in silence. Among them, a small leather-bound diary. It belonged to my grandmother. Her handwriting was neat, almost fragile. On the last page, she'd written something that stopped me cold. "We believed we could bury the past, but roots grow even in the dark. One day, someone will dig them up. I just hope it's someone brave enough not to hate us for it." I sat there for a long time, the diary trembling in my hands. Because I realized she hadn't written that for herself, she'd written it for me. That night, I lit a single candle and placed it by the window. No flames roaring, no ashes flying, just one small, steady light. Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, almost kind. It tapped against the glass like an old lullaby. For the first time, I didn't feel cursed, just tired, human. I didn't know where my father had gone. I didn't know what would happen to the estate, or the name, or the story. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The next morning, I packed a suitcase, locked the door, and walked away. No ceremony, no goodbye, just footsteps fading into the mist. The house stood behind me, old, wounded, silent. And though I'd burned the truth, I carried its ashes with me. Not as a burden, as a reminder. Because the past doesn't vanish when the fire goes out. It lingers, waiting, until someone chooses to live differently. I walked for miles that morning, the suitcase heavy, but somehow lighter than the weight I'd carried for decades. The town behind me disappeared in fog and mist, the Duarte estate shrinking into a memory that felt more like a dream than a prison. Each step was quiet, deliberate, a rhythm that I allowed myself to follow without thought or fear. The rain had stopped. For the first time in years, the air smelled of clean earth, not of decay or smoke. The sky was pale, stretched wide, and the sunlight, hesitant, fragile, touched my face in gentle warmth. I realized I could breathe without guilt clawing at my chest. Not completely, not yet, but enough to start. I thought of my grandmother and the nights she had whispered truths I wasn't ready to hear. I thought of my father, disappearing into silence, carrying the same burden I would never fully understand. I thought of Mateus and Clara Andrade, whose names had been stolen, whose lives had been rewritten by someone else's ambition. And I felt a strange kind of peace. Because I had chosen, not revenge, not blind justice, not silence that poisons, but something in between, responsibility tempered by mercy. I had carried the ashes of truth and decided what to do with them. I burned what needed burning, held what needed remembering, and walked away from what could no longer define me. I stopped at a small cafe on the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize. The smell of coffee, warm bread, and sunlight spilling through the windows felt like an invitation to begin again. I sat down, put the suitcase at my feet, and opened a notebook I had brought along. For the first time, I began to write, not letters, not proof, not confessions, but a story of understanding, of survival, of learning to live with the weight of inherited scenes without being crushed by them. People came and went, strangers who didn't know the names that had haunted me, who had no idea of the houses, fires, and lies behind me. They smiled, ordered their coffee, laughed quietly at small jokes. And for the first time, I could imagine living a life untethered from the past, a life that was mine. I thought about forgiveness. Not for them, not for me, for the world. For the simple fact that life continues, that the rain falls, that the trees grow, even when the soil is poisoned. That's the lesson my grandmother had tried to teach, the one my father had struggled to live by, the one I was only beginning to understand. I left the cafe, the notebook under my arm, and walked into the streets. The sunlight grew stronger, chasing away shadows, filling cracks I hadn't noticed before. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The past was a landscape I had traversed, marked by fire, tears, and hard choices. And now it was behind me, not erased, not forgiven, but transformed into something that could finally exist without control over me. I felt the wind on my face, the warmth of the day, the pulse of life moving around me. And in that moment, I realized that freedom isn't the absence of burden, but the courage to carry it differently. I am neither Duarte nor Andrade. I am the one who walks forward, beyond the ashes, carrying what I must, leaving the rest behind. And for the first time in a lifetime, I felt the weight lift, not completely, never completely, but enough to finally step into the light. Now you know the truth, but what would you do with it? Could you forgive, or would you burn it all to the ground? If this story moved you, hit like, comment your choice, and subscribe to follow the journey of secrets, lies, and the courage to face them. The story doesn't end here, it lives with us.